Escaping from Eden, Chapter 4. It's getting good, y'all. This chapter is a lot of forgetting. Paul, do you realize that what you're saying sounds absolutely crazy? Brad had what some people like to call a gift of encouragement. So let's just recap. He's getting to the point where he's understanding that Elohim and God are two separate, they're not one and the same as we have been taught. Elohim are the powerful ones, or what we in the Hebrew Israelite community learned to say were the mighty ones, and then Yahweh or Yahuwah or the Lord is the creator of all, the Almighty. So the Anunnaki are considered the sky people or the powerful ones, and then the Lord is the Almighty or God Himself. And so he's coming to this conclusion that they are not one and the same, that they are separate. And he's starting to talk to his friends about defining what they believe, or does it make sense to them. And then he's trying to carry this on through. And he's talking to one of his friends in particular. And so here we go with that conversation. So let me start that over. I'm actually going to start it at the end of chapter 3. The last paragraph of chapter 3, so that because he kind of leaves each chapter with a cliffhanger, so you almost have to go back to that last paragraph of the chapter before to jump into the current chapter. So I'm going to start this again, starting with the last paragraph of chapter 3, and then move into 4. I needed to hear from some experts from outside the realm of literature, out in the tangible flesh and blood world of history, people who deal with empirical things, archaeologists and paleontologists, and perhaps an anthropologist or two. Perhaps I could find a proper scientist to reassure me that humans are just humans living comfortably alone in the universe, or to brace me for the alternative. This journey was about to take me out of my seclusion beyond the state of Victoria and out of Australia. Indeed, out of all my comfort zones and all around the world on a paradigm-shifting voyage of discovery. But first, I needed a beer. Paul, do you realize that what you're saying sounds absolutely crazy? Brad had what some people call a gift of encouragement, and over this particular beer, he was giving it out in spades. We were enjoying a glass at my favorite watering hole at Old Stream Pass. A beer will be good for your leg, he said. Good muscle relaxant. So while my glass of Hefeweizen went to work on my leg, I put to Brad some of my speculations. If you repluralize that word, it portals you back to the earlier version of the story. In that version, in the time leading up to the flood in Genesis 6, there are at least 4 kinds of entity in the text. 2 extraterrestrial species, Elohim and Ben Elohim, plus humans, and a hybrid species called Nephilim, and they're all plurals. Same deal in the cuneiforms, I continued, at least 3 kinds of entity. 1 ET species, the sky people, then humans, and some random hybrids. Same scenario. Brad looked nonplussed. Paul, you're pinning a lot on one word. What if, back in the day, the editors who changed Elohim into God somehow knew better than you and actually got it right? What if Elohim just happens to look like a plural? But Brad, it doesn't just look like a plural, it behaves like one. Plural form, plural verbs, plural behaviors, plural agendas, plural moralities even. As soon as you repluralize Elohim, the stories begin to make sense and the anomalies stop being anomalies. Paul, you've always prided yourself in being orthodox to the bones. What's the point of that if you're going to publish this? People are going to buy this just to laugh at it. I mean, just think about it for a minute. If what you're saying is true, that human beings were engineered by ETs, don't you think we'd remember? That's a huge bit of history for us to forget. That's a lot of forgetting. It's ridiculous. You couldn't forget something that big. Fair point. How could an intelligent species just up and forget where it came from? Brad is a sci-fi junkie which is why I had thought he might be intrigued by what I was writing about. So I reached for a sci-fi metaphor. Brad, the truth is out there. Maybe sometimes the truth is so out there that we can only speak it as fiction. Think about the Tim Burton version of Planet of the Apes, the one with Mark Wahlberg. This was a movie we both had seen. In that story, something big has been forgotten. We're on a planet where apes rule and humans are the dumb slaves. If anyone were to say there was a time where apes were the slaves and humans were the masters, they would be absolutely ridiculed. They'd be shut down. They would be out of a job. But then it turns out there is this forbidden area where the apes aren't allowed to go. The whole area is guarded by gorillas to prevent access because it is a cultural site, a holy site. It's protected. The apes call it Kalima. It's the birthplace of their god, Seamus. However, when Mark Wahlberg finds it and dusts off that old word, we discover that the strange syllables Kalima are actually the remnants of some older words. Caution, live animals. The words have been obscured by the sands of time. It turns out that the forbidden area conceals some ancient technology, which includes an enclosed area where the live animals in question were kept. Seamus was one of those animals, not a god, but an ape with higher powers, because in the time when humans were the masters, they had genetically modified him. Only the old ape, Charlton Heston, knows the truth. His name is Zaius, and he is the guardian of the forbidden knowledge. Hidden in his own home, Zaius keeps an artifact from that long-forgotten time. It's a weapon of phenomenal power, a pistol. His son-in-law can't believe it when Zaius repeats the insanity as if it were history. Once apes were the slaves and humans were the masters. It's the same story. The apes get genetically modified by a higher species to become a more useful slave. That's exactly what plural Genesis and the cuneiform tablets say about us. In Planet of the Apes, after the higher species disappears, the story of their ape origins gets half forgotten, half buried with the crucial artifacts, all hidden away to keep the story forgotten. How the apes do their forgetting is exactly how we do our forgetting. The meaning of words gets obscured by the sands of time. Anomalous artifacts get hidden away in the bowels of our museums. UNESCO World Heritage and UN military keep us away from our forbidden areas, and we question the sanity of anyone who repeats the unofficial story. It's the same thing. I reckon that's what the movie is all about. For instance, look at what happened to that guy I mentioned before at Colgate University. He got fired just for telling the Sumerian story. Look at what happened to John Mack, Harvard professor, Pulitzer Prize winner. He was Harvard's head of clinical psychology. All good until the 1990s, when the U.S. military invites John to do some psych assessments of senior military personnel who had filed reports of close encounters with ETs. When he does, he begins to notice some unusual patterns. Then he probes a bit further, widening his sample base to include civil aviation personnel and others. When he brings his report back to the military, he says, something is going on that cannot be explained as a psychological phenomenon. These people are experiencing something that we need to look into. The moment he puts that into the public domain, authorities jump into action to destroy him. He's intimidated. His job is threatened. He's ridiculed in the press. He had to bring in top legal counsel just to keep his job. It was horrendous. And the message was clear. Let others beware. That's how we forget. If forgetting is rewarded and remembering is punished, it's easier to forget. Same deal in Christianity. The classic example is Marcion in the 2nd century. He was a bishop with churches across Asia Minor and the Mediterranean who followed his theology. His argument was that the God and Father of Jesus comes across totally different to the angry, genociding God of the Old Testament. They can't both be accurate representations of God, he said. If we measure claims about God against Jesus, then we really have to jettison the Old Testament, because the two visions of God are simply incompatible. Marcion believed the Elohim stories were about a completely different kind of entity. Today we remember Marcion as a heretic. What we forget is that those who formalized the Orthodox line actually agreed with 90% of what Marcion was saying. Now Origen comes along to help the Orthodox bishops answer Marcion's questions. He says, "Don't worry, everybody. You don't have to take those problem stories of the Old Testament at face value. When God does something indefensible, just don't preach the plain meaning. Read it some other way. Find the moral of the story and preach on that. Or you can read it as a prophecy about Jesus or the church. Preach it that way, and you'll find there's no problem. Jesus and the apostles never preached the plain meaning. They always drew on the other layers in the old stories. So feel free to do the same." And that, more or less, became the Orthodox line. There was a stream that lent towards more literal interpretations. It was called the Antiochian school. But if ever an Orthodox preacher needed a bit of wiggle room to avoid the real difficulties in a bit of the Bible, it was Origen's threefold reading that gave the church a framework. What Origen taught is really what most preachers have done ever since, without even thinking about it. But when it's all boiled down, the fact is Origen and Marcion saw the exact same problem. There is a basic incompatibility between the Old and New Testament's vision of God. Both were actually agreed on that. It's just that Origen and Marcion each found different ways of cordoning off the problem. Because Origen's line became orthodoxy and Marcion got thrown out as a heretic, we tend to forget all the good that was in Marcion's contribution. He gets destroyed, excommunicated, and there's not a trace of anything he wrote. For all that, Marcion still had a massive following among the early churches, who all had to learn to be ignored or insulted. Listened to or not, the Marcionite churches fully believed that the Elohim stories are simply not God's stories. Their interpretation of Genesis was that other entities were involved in the creation of humans and of the world we know. So it's not a new idea. By excommunicating Marcion and labeling him as a heretic, the mainstream bishops were saying, "Brothers and sisters, we don't have to think any further about all that. A decision has been made. Never mind that all those in his churches in Asia Minor and the Mediterranean hold to Marcion's reading, a church network that survived Marcion by half a millennium. No, don't worry. Let's keep it simple. If we label Marcion a heretic, we don't even have to look into that." They even destroyed Marcion's works so that future generations of believers wouldn't be in danger of stumbling across this alternative account of the Bible and humanity's beginnings. I am guessing, but at the very least it's strange that not one of Marcion's books has ever surfaced, which is a bit funny. So Brad, I reckon that's how we forget. We're told to. If the authorities say this is what happened and you're crazy if you think any different, then remembering takes a lot of courage and can bring you a heap of trouble. It becomes an act of rebellion. Brad paused for a moment and quickly massaged his right eyebrow to help him absorb my argument. Finally, he spoke. "Planet of the Apes," he said. "Planet of the Apes. Clearly your problem is that you're having some trouble distinguishing fiction from history. Planet of the Apes is fiction. There have been, 7 versions of Planet of the Apes? Because it's a great story. That's what mythology is. That's what the Sumerian tablets are. That's what the Genesis stories are. That's why you're finding several versions of the same story. Because it's a great story. The fact that something repeats doesn't turn it from a fable into fact. You're reading these mythologies like a fundamentalist. Shouldn't the fantastical content tell you that the stories are nothing more than very old fiction?" I didn't pause to point out that there are some things he and I would both hold to be true that others might seem pretty fantastical. Fantastical doesn't have to mean zero fact, though, does it? I offered. For instance, when I went to see The Madness of King George III, I came home thinking what an amazing story it was and wondering what parts of it might be true. That's a perfectly reasonable question, isn't it? So I took myself to the local library and read all the history I could find on the period. Turns out that, other than in the license of screenplaying it, it was all true. Same when I watched Downfall. Fantastical, but it turns out meticulously researched, word by word. You ask, how could such a huge part of our memory have been forgotten? I would say it hasn't been forgotten. Almost every culture around the world has found a way of remembering it. They retell it each in their own traditions and artwork and mythologies. All right, you can laugh at me and say poor Paul's forgotten how to distinguish fact from fiction. Perhaps the ancients who authored the world's mythologies would laugh at us and say that we've forgotten how to recognize history when we see it. Even after a few more beers, Brad and I eventually had to agree to differ. His point was fair when he said that repetition from one mythology to the next was no proof of facticity. And yes, it was only to be expected that Abraham and Sarah would have carried memory and mythology from Sumerian culture into Hebrew memory and culture. In fact, the knowledge of Genesis borrowing from Mesopotamian sources is really nothing new. An array of books on the subject hit the academic bookshelves back in the late 1890s. So how is it that this same knowledge can still scandalize people today? Partly, I think it's that it doesn't make for very inspiring preaching, and if the preachers don't teach it, then most followers of the Bible won't find out. The other part of the equation is that the news cycle moves on. A slew of books comes out on one topic. Next season, it's celebrity cookbooks. What's hot on the evening news can be megaphoned one day and buried the next, and nobody bats an eyelid. For many years, I have simply accepted the general view of Marcion as an unfortunate maker of mistakes back in the day. Now I had to wonder if Marcion and the considerable network of churches that fell in line with him might have been onto something. Despite their foundational roles in Orthodox Christianity, most Christians would have little or no awareness of the ideas put forward by Marcion and Origen. Believers may be familiar with their orthodoxy while completely unfamiliar with what the alternative views were that got ruled out back in the day. There is such a thing as informed orthodoxy, but for the faith community at large, defining and policing mainstream doctrine is itself an exercise of brushing other interpretations away. There is, of course, a very deliberate kind of forgetting that can happen when cultures have things they may positively wish to forget. For instance, when Britain was at war with Germany, a fair bit of name changing was done among our royals to help the British people feel more comfortable with the Saxe-Coburg-Gotha family holding the British crown. As in the previous war with Germany, members of the royal family whose German accents were too pronounced were kept carefully out of public earshot. After the war, the previous enthusiasm of senior royals for deals with the Nazi leadership and alliances with Herr Hitler were tactfully not mentioned. No need. It would be insensitive. It wouldn't be helpful. For the people of Israel while in exile, the culture of their Babylonian and Assyrian captors would have evoked exactly the same kind of fear and loathing that Nazi culture later evoked among the Allied countries. To the Jewish exiles, any fellow feeling any sense of a cultural debt to their Babylonian or Syrian captors would have been totally unpalatable. Every cultural and religious difference would have been emphasized to the max, and every point of brotherhood and sisterhood diminished. Nothing that felt or smelled even remotely Babylonian would be likely to reach a Jewish sermon of that period. Now, if shared memory is not shared and skips a generation, it is all but forgotten. Israel was exiled in Assyria for a decade and then in Babylon for 70 years. That's more than 3 generations. And it is during that precise period, the Babylonian exile of the 6th century BC, that many scholars believe the current version of Genesis was redacted, by which I mean changed from an earlier version. Time and reason for a lot of forgetting. Whatever the faith community we are part of, we preachers always have to be careful not to stray too far from the official storylines, regardless of what longer memory or close attention to the sources might ask of us. The background of groupthink, secret shibboleths, and unspoken community guidelines all conspire to keep us squarely on the rails. But when you're holed up in a shipping crate for weeks on end while your traction device works away at your leg, the pressure of groupthink is no longer there. Your thoughts don't need to neatly resolve in the few short days before the next sermon is due. You have the freedom to push the boat out a little further and pursue your questions further. To get any further, though, I needed to find a Zaius or two to help me. Some guardians or some artifacts of the old, forbidden story. Might there be objects in our own museums and protected areas pointing to the more complex prehistory? Could there be vestiges of our ancient heritage hidden in our very DNA? These were avenues I had to follow. In Planet of the Apes, when General Thade takes the pistol from Elder Zaius, he fingers it and sniffs it. He is clearly unhappy that the very existence of this artifact instantly shoots to pieces the apes' erroneous mythology of beginnings, a mythology which framed the world that General Thade lived to protect. How ready was he for his cherished world to be overturned? The analogy made me wonder, what solid, tangible artifacts might exist in our time, on our planet, that might overturn our own cherished beliefs and suppositions? And what new story of beginnings might emerge from them? That is the end of chapter 4. Peace and blessings to you all.